Hello everybody, and welcome to iCAAD. Welcome to your second presentation of the day. My name's Matt Thomas. I'm one of the iCAAD directors, and I'm really thrilled that Dr. Simon Proctor has agreed to join us today. Nordoff Robbins is the biggest charity that the entire music industry supports, and I was in the music industry for 20 years and subsequently went on to form the charity Music Support that you can find out more about out there. And I was a fundraiser for Nordoff Robbins. I was on a committee for Nordoff Robbins. I got very drunk at a lot of Nordoff Robbins lunches, which is like the music industry event of the year. And so I'm fully aware of the amazing work that Nordoff Robbins do throughout the country with music therapy and the people that they help, and the absolute amazing work that they do. My mother's very elderly. She has fairly bad dementia, and the other day we were just talking about what it was like in the old days, and I got my iPad and I put a song on that neither of us had heard for about 30 years, and she sat up, she chirped, and she started singing along to it. And this is a lady who can't remember what you were talking about 5 minutes ago, and it changed the day entirely. And it's work like that Nordoff Robbins are doing in a professional manner, not in a training manner, in a rigorous manner, and really helping people out there. And I'm really moved by the work that they do, and I'm delighted as iCAAD, when I came into iCAAD, and we're making a real effort to broaden all of the modalities that we look at, and to be very inclusive. And I feel very strongly Nordoff Robbins does a lot of work for mental health. Mental health includes addiction, and I'm really happy to welcome them to the iCAAD fold, and long may it last. So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Simon Proctor, who is the Director of Clinical Services at Nordoff Robbins, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what they do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. So, what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about what this weird thing called Nordoff Robbins is, what music therapy is, what it has to offer generally in mental health services, and a little bit focusing in on addiction as well. I should explain that I am actually Director of Music Services at Nordoff Robbins, and I have spent much of my career working in inpatient psychiatric services, as well as overseeing training of music therapists more recently. So what I'm going to look at today is this list, really. So thinking about the idea of music as therapy, what people mean when they say music therapy, what the geography looks like. Think about why music in the first place, what's so special about music, what's its relevance. And then thinking about why specifically music in mental health services. Then I'll be giving you some examples from practice. The examples from mental health practice I will be just talking to you about. To preserve confidentiality, I can't play you recordings of them, although I will earlier show you some recordings of work with children that we have permission to show, just to give you some ideas of the kinds of things that go on in music therapy. Then very briefly thinking about assessing usefulness, offering some service user perspectives on music therapy. And as you see, we have some instruments here, and my plan is that some of you will make music with me before you leave this room, and then we'll wrap it up at the end. Okay, so first of all, music as therapy. So people have been using music in pursuit of health and well-being forever and ever. It's nothing new. It's as old as the hills, and it happens around the world. So in very different cultures, people use music in pursuit of health and wellness. And of course, what people mean by that will vary according to the culture. And of course, there are different musics in different parts of the world as well. So if you go to Mongolia or to the Central African Republic, you'll hear music which is very different to what you hear if you switch on the radio in London. Music therapy as a professionalised activity is relatively new. It can take many forms. So if you see an article about music therapy, don't just assume it's the same thing as the last article you read about music therapy. So you'll find that some music therapies are what you might call passive and some are active. So by passive, I mean that the person who is receiving music therapy isn't actively participating in it, but might be listening, or might perhaps be taken on some kind of experiential journey using music. By active, I mean that the person is actually participating by using musical instruments or maybe music technology. You don't necessarily have to have instruments like this nowadays to make music. People have music making devices on their phones and their iPads. Sometimes you hear about receptive or participatory music therapy, and it's the same kind of thing. I'm not going to go too much into kind of theoretical constructs of music therapy today, but if you'd like to talk about that later, we certainly can. So music therapy as a profession is really a 20th century invention. It became widespread in the United States after World War I. It's often attributed to people having shell shock, returning to the States after the war and finding that actually there was not a lot available and music was used. It's somewhat newer in Europe. In the UK, it's been really established since the 1960s. It's now formally regulated by the Health and Care Professions Council, which is the regulatory body that looks after most sort of allied health professions. So everything from dietitians to radiographers to paramedics, OTs, music therapists, lots of other people as well. It requires a master's level training, and there are 7 of those training programs in the UK. There's 3 in London, one by Nordoff Robbins. We also have a base in Manchester at the Royal Northern College of Music. There's one at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London, one at Roehampton, one in Bristol at the University of West of England, one at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, one in Wales at Newport, and one in Scotland at Queen Margaret University. So there is a nationwide spread of training opportunities. And essentially what these trainings do is they take musicians. So very often when people say, oh, I really like the sound of music therapy, do I need to be a musician to do that? The answer is yes, you do need to be a musician. The tradition in the UK is of active music making with people. So it's expected that a music therapist is a musician and is enough of a musician that they're not thinking about what to play so much as focusing on the person they're working with and the relationship they're building with that person. So essentially the trainings help people to use the skills they have with people with particular needs. And meeting the requirements of the HCPC, students need to learn to work with a wide range of people in a wide range of circumstances. So typically a student would train to work with children and with adults, to work with people with learning disabilities, to work with people with developmental delay, to work with people with mental health issues of some kind or another. So therefore students need to learn about pathologies. They need to know what it means to have autism or schizophrenia or dementia or addiction. And they need to know not just what it means in kind of biological medical terms, but what it means in the way it impacts on people's lives. So living with an addiction, living with a dementia is about much more than what is trackable in terms of chemicals and states of the brain, for example. It's very much about its impact on people's day-to-day lives and their ability to function and to have relationships with people and to find life satisfying. So that prompts us to think about how music is relevant. So we know that some people come to music therapy with a very clear and strong sense of their own musical identity. You know, I love rock and roll, or I'm a rapper, or whatever it is. For other people, they have a strong feeling that I'm not a musician, I'm not into music, and maybe this isn't for me. So it's necessary for music therapists to be clear about what they can and can't offer. Obviously, they also need to learn professional skills. Music therapists work in environments where many other professionals work. You'll find a lot of music therapists in special education, so they need to work with teachers and educational psychologists, people like that. They work a lot in psychiatric services, so they need to be able to work with psychologists and psychiatrists and CPNs. They work in dementia care, they work in neuro rehab. So you can see there's a wide range of people they need to be able to talk with. They need to think critically. I think it's very easy to get a bit sentimental about music therapy. People often think of music as some magical panacea, which it isn't. And we need to be thinking very critically about what we're doing. But also, we need to be thinking about the very practical, what I call craft skills, the things people can actually do with people. So it's all very well having a theoretical knowledge about this, but you have to spend time training to actually be able to help people have different experiences in music. And that's a fundamentally musical craft. You need to know why you're doing it, but you also have to be able to do it. So I'm just going to explain this weird label of Nordoff Robbins. It describes both a particular approach to music therapy and the organisation, which you heard described at the beginning as well. So it's named after its founders. It's not to be confused with Baskin-Robbins, and etc. Paul Nordoff was an American pianist and composer, long history of teaching piano to very talented classical students in the States. Clive Robbins was a British teacher of children with special needs, with a history of working in Steiner schools in the anthroposophical tradition. They came together and put together really Paul Nordoff's kind of understanding of how music worked, its structure, and the elements within it, and Clive Robbins' understanding of the needs of the children in the places where they were working together. They worked first in England. They met at Sunfield, which is still going strong as an anthroposophical children's school in the West Midlands. And then later they worked in the States, in Scandinavia, and in Germany. It's often described as a music-centred approach to music therapy. I said I wasn't going to talk theory. I'm going to talk theory for 30 seconds. So music-centred is often used to distinguish this approach from things like a behavioural approach or a psychoanalytic approach. The idea is that it's very pragmatic. We do what seems to work with people. We think about why it's working, and then we learn from that and work as musical allies with the people we're working with. So we're not administering musical treatment to someone. We're really finding our way alongside the client. So in many ways, you could think of it as client-centred, music-led, something like that. I hope that will become clear when you see some examples of music therapy in action. Gary Ansdell is one of the great authors about music therapy. He has this lovely phrase that music therapy works the way music works. And that's a very music-centred way of thinking about music therapy. So people will often tell you about getting caught up in music. You know, you listen to something on the radio, your foot goes, or you find yourself singing along, or you're tapping away, or you find yourself singing without even noticing it. So music kind of gathers us up. And we find ourselves drawn into the structure of the music, into the beat, into the tonality of it. Even if we don't have the theoretical tools to describe that, as people, we get drawn into it. Tia Denora, who's a very famous music sociologist, talks about music having affordances, by which she means it offers us opportunities to do things. And some of those we're very aware of. So, for example, when we use music to set a social scene, if we put on, romantic music for a romantic occasion, we're very deliberately using the affordances of music. But at other times, perhaps we're not so aware of what the affordances are. So when we get drawn into spending longer in a shop because of the music that's on the sound system, that's a kind of very deliberate affordance used by the shop, but perhaps not by the shopper. And likewise in music therapy, the therapist needs to be aware of what the affordances of music are. So for someone who's chaotic, can music help them to be more organised? And for someone who's very rigid, can music free them up? And so on. This obviously requires an attention to musical detail. So we're not just talking about doing a bit of music. We're actually thinking about the music that we're doing all the time. And part of it is the cultivation of musical companionship. So when people are drawn into improvisational music making with other people, they often report surprise as to how quickly it feels comfortable or intimate or making sense or something like that. It's different from the kind of relationship you have when you're talking to someone. It's not the same, but it is a kind of companionship. So you can feel yourself being accompanied. We talk in music about accompanying people. It's about being a companion to someone. It doesn't mean that the companionship is necessarily totally reciprocal. In classical music, there's a tradition of accompanying where the pianist is seen as supporting but slightly in the background to the big soloist. And that's often compared to the work that goes on in music therapy too. It's also based on the understanding that the musical is the personal and the social. So music doesn't exist in a vacuum. We make music with other people, and that's very obvious if you talk to people who are in bands or orchestras or sing in a choir. They will tell you about how much they love going there, not just in terms of the sound of the music, but the interactions they have with other people. So you can't really unpick the musical from the social and the personal. The personal also because of identity. People invest themselves into music and often bring that identity with them to music therapy. And finally, very important is a valuing of musical experience. And that's the experience I have of myself making music, but also the experience I have of making music with other people. And so as music therapists, this is something that's the stuff we work with and something that matters to a great deal. Okay, so I'm now going to show you a sort of historic clip of Paul Nordoff and Clive Robbins in action. I just need to explain it. And the reason I'm showing it to you is just to give you a really brief snapshot of the kinds of focus that they had in their work. This film was made by Norwegian television when Nordoff and Robbins visited Oslo in the early 1970s. They apparently arrived on a boat, were taken to a school where they're going to work, and in the school waiting for them was a camera crew. Not a very comfortable first day doing work in a school, but they were there to kind of demonstrate the work they were doing. They were on a research fellowship and they were there to train up people working with them in the school. You'll see that this doesn't look like a traditional therapy setting. You'll see that there is a group of children, I assume it's a class of children, sitting in a kind of semicircle around a piano, and there's a drum and a cymbal by the piano, and they select one of the children to come up and play with them. And so we're going to see a little girl called Karen being invited to come and play. And Paul Nordoff at the piano sets up this interaction with her. So see what you make of this.
Karen. Ja?
So it's slightly out of sync, which doesn't help. But did you get the idea of how this was a kind of special occasion? Yeah, so it's like, oh, me. It's a big thing for her to go out and play with them. And I think music often is an occasion, an event. And music therapy is no exception to that. And as she walks up to the piano, Paul Nordoff is already accompanying her. So as she walks, he's following the way she walks. He's going with her body movement. He's getting a sense of how she is, kind of wide eyes and expectation. And he's playing musically with that. So he's not just launching into the same thing he does with everyone. he's, if you like, composing in the moment something specifically tailored to her. And he kind of keeps it quite open. So he just plays with his right hand. It's very simple. There's no bass. He's not committing himself to much harmony or anything until she starts playing. And then he lands on what feels like the tonic, the home note of the music. And it starts developing between the two of them. And they're playing together for a bit. And then it kind of accelerates. It's not quite clear to me who's doing it. It accelerates and then it disintegrates a bit. And there's a bit in the middle where they kind of, it's not quite clear what's going to happen next. It's a bit awkward. And Paul Nordoff tries to suggest something. She comes in, Paul Nordoff goes too fast. And then he slows down to her tempo and they're off together again. So in just a few seconds, you have a whole kind of tranche of things going on. You've got this kind of encountering of each other at the very beginning. You've got the coming together. You've got an interruption and uncertainty, and you've got a re-establishing of a working relationship again. So that's really, really fast. So I'm just going to play that again and see if any of that you can hear better this time.
Karen. Karen. Ja?
So that's just to give you a flavour of the kind of attention that gets paid in music therapy. Usually individual sessions are done privately. Yeah, so we're not usually working with one person in front of a group. We do work individually and in small groups, just as I'm sure many of you are used to. Closed groups, open groups, slow open groups, sometimes quite public and totally open groups, sometimes working towards performance even. But that's just to give you a flavour of the kind of musical attention involved. Okay, so let's go on now and think about why music. So there are lots of things you can do as therapies, and all in their own way they have perhaps something to offer. I'm only going to talk about music. So, number one is that to be human is to be a musician. Now, we live in a weird kind of culture in Western Europe where people think that only a very tiny proportion of people could possibly be musicians. Most people say, well, I'm not a musician. I can't play an instrument. I can't sing. Some people have very bad experiences of being told at school, for example, that they are not good at music or they can't sing and they should shut up when everyone else sings. However, if we wind things back to early life, we know that even very young children, and I mean really, really, really young children, use music, or at least the primary dimensions of music, as a means of interaction. So I'm going to show you a video in a minute of Colwyn Trevarthen. I'm sure some of you are aware of Colwyn Trevarthen. Psychologist who's done a lot of work on this idea of communicative musicality. So he doesn't mean that little children sing and dance as such, but if you analyse the interactions of very young babies with their primary caregivers, what you notice is the timing and the phrasing and the melodies, the shared melodies and the turn-taking that goes on. And this is something that is not just taught by the parent to the child. Children provoke it too in a healthily developing child. So music is a way in which we learn to interact with our caregivers. So we all know that when parents interact with their children, they suddenly abandon their reserve and they start talking in kind of motherese. Oh, whoa, yes, oh, yes. We exaggerate the musical components of what we do. We talk in a much wider pitch range than we normally would. We repeat things in smaller chunks than we normally would. And in this way, we start doing musical duets with our children. However, very young children can't distinguish between moving and using their voice. Everything happens at once. And so it's amodal. So the music is about movement and noise and gesture and face just as much as it is about music as such. And that's a lesson to us as well. Certainly in classical music, there's a weird tradition as well of telling people not to move when they play music. Except, of course, when you watch great classical musicians, they move all the time. If you watch bands, the way they move together is a really key feature of a band. The way chamber musicians move together gives a feel to them of what they're doing with each other. So movement is very much a part of music too. I also want to bust one myth about music, which is to do with this idea that music always expresses something. So lots of people will say, oh, that's a very sad piece of music. Someone sings in a minor key, they'll say, oh, they're obviously feeling very sad. However, you talk to musicians, they might say, I sang that because I love that song. I love that piece. It doesn't mean I'm sad. I might like being expressive, but I'm not necessarily expressing sadness. So when we're talking about music in music therapy, we have to distinguish between expressiveness or expressivity, to use a musical term, and expression in the sense of expression of emotion. They may come together, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So we need to attend to the kind of musical dimensions of what people are doing and be quite sort of phenomenological about it, rather than jumping to an interpretation of what people are doing musically. So musical features are features of being human. We all use musical features all the time. We tend to downplay it and not notice it. We all have experiences through walking of a regular rhythm. So we all have a slightly different gait. The way we walk is distinguishing of us. The way we talk, the melodies of our voices. And of course, when we're talking with other people, there's interaction between us. So some conversations are marked by long pauses. Some people who know each other very well jump in on top of each other all the time. And sometimes you can hear a sort of syncopation in the interaction between people. So one person's going dum, dum, the other's going da-dum, dum, da-dum, dum. And so there's a huge musical dimension to everyday functioning as a human being, particularly when we're interacting with other human beings. So enough of me talking. Here's someone who really knows what he's talking about. So here's Colwyn Trevathan. This is a YouTube video that in which he's interviewed about the child's use of musical dimensions, and he's particularly focusing on language development here.
One of the things that's important is that the rhythms and expression, the melodic kind of patterns that seem to be the material of human thinking and problem solving and grammar of language, all of this kind of dynamic patterning, which makes things happen through time and makes them predictable to other people. This, the kind of thing that is going on between a mother and a baby, as Daniel Stern pointed out, it's amodal, that is, it's between the modalities. It can be audible or visible, or you can feel it in body movement, and the dynamics are common to everything that we do, and so any sense can pick it up. We have an extraordinary film of a 5-month-old baby who was born blind, and a Swedish baby, and the mother is singing a baby song, and the baby is conducting the baby song beautifully with its left hand, just like a professional conductor, and conducting the melody beautifully, going up for pitch and going down at the end of a phrase, just like a conductor. And when our professor of music saw that, Professor Nigel Osborne, he said, yes, the baby is conducting like a professional conductor and with some anticipation. So we checked it, and the baby is 1/3 of a second ahead of the mother, It's leading the mother through a familiar song and with beautiful skill. So that translation of the mother's voice into the baby's hand is intuitive, completely intuitive. Nobody knew the baby was doing this until we saw the film. And it was discovered in the film. But that is a film which impresses people very much. They realize, of course, we're actually moving inside ourselves with other people all the time. Now, I think it's a very sad thing that linguists who have been first attracted to the structure of text, written text, had strayed into a very complex field of the science of language and come up with the idea that language has grammatical rules, which are kind of logical or structural rules, and forgotten that the origin of these rules is in the dynamic of human body movement.
Okay. So here's an example of conducting. As I said, the examples I'm going to show you are not with adult client groups for confidentiality reasons, but many of the same principles apply. So this example is with a little girl who is attending a school for children with profound and multiple learning difficulties. She's a little girl who can't easily communicate. She doesn't have language. She's physically quite restricted. She can move her arms and her head, but she's in a wheelchair. She's very dependent on adults around her to feed her and clothe her and wash her and change her and so on. And here she's getting an experience of being the boss. So here she's actually in charge of what's going on in the relationship. And this is essentially conducting. If you show this to a musician, it's like, blimey, she's conducting. Yep. Working with adults, able-bodied, verbal, reflective adults, it might manifest itself slightly differently, but nevertheless the experience of directing music from another person or even a group of people can be quite a powerful one. So let's watch this as an example. So there you can see an example of a child leading by example, a child who's normally considered not to be able to do very much, and for whom the experience of leading is probably a very powerful one. Likewise with adults who might come to an individual music therapy session, the experience of having a musician follow them very closely, whether they're sitting with them at the keyboard or whether they're moving around the room, can be sometimes a bit perturbing, but often very powerful. And even if it takes people by surprise at first, it's a very kind of natural thing to move into. To think, aha, this is what's going on, and enjoy it and play with it and be playful, and then perhaps, if possible, think about why that felt the way it felt. Okay, Another aspect of music is its potential for collaboration, particularly in groups. I've already mentioned choirs and bands and orchestras. People enjoy making music together, and that often entails quite a lot of work. So musicians playing together tend to have to practice things, rehearse them, and that means doing things again and again, and that means taking notice of what each other are doing so that their music gets better in some way. So this is another aspect of music. And again, I don't have permission to show you an adult group from psychiatric services, but I'm going to show you a bunch of teenagers who have moderate learning difficulties, and they are attending a music therapy session on a weekly basis to kind of build up their ability to collaborate with each other. There are some real tensions within the group. You might pick some of those up. But here, each person has a role and they're working at things over time. So you'll notice that some of this is quite practiced. So these are arrangements which have been made specially for them, songs which have been tailored to the group, and different people take on different roles. Oops, here we are.
Coming to the music room, if for everyone, coming to the music room, it can have some fun, we can sing and we can play, don't go ready, don't go away, welcome to the music room.
Coming to the music room is for everyone. Coming to the music room, we can have some fun. We can sing and we can play. Now get ready, don't go away. Welcome to the music room. Good to see you all. Really. All right, now I want everybody just to blow.
I know, right hand, the other one.
Okay, just blow your right hand. Okay. Right hand. Everybody. Right hand. Left hand. Okay. Right hand. Left hand. Listen. Again. Right hand. Left hand. Listen. I like that. Okay. We can use that. Right hand. Left hand.
So you get the idea. So they've been working at this over a number of weeks, and it's gradually coming together into something quite coherent. Sometimes that might lead to a performance, something like that. Sometimes it's more that the process starts with songwriting, for example. So a group of people who can come together and think together. It can be a creative project over a number of days, for example. Often when the group doesn't know each other very well, a way of getting to know each other quite safely is to kind of write a song together and then work on playing it, performing it, recording it perhaps. And that's often what happens in mental health services, and particularly addiction services. So people can kind of express with words something of a situation, but the music kind of puts a form to it and boundaries it in that way. Okay, so why music in mental health services, since I've actually shown you examples not from mental health services? Well, key to mental health are things like, I'm not going to be very technical here, but the ability to self-regulate, the ability to attune with others, the ability to collaborate with others, the ability to be effectively expressive, so to have a sense that I'm getting across what I mean when I say things or communicate things, a sense that one matters and is heard, a sense of agency and a sense of contributing to the whole. And on the other hand, you might say that mental illness is the opposite of that, so an inability to do those things and a lack of sense that one matters and is heard. So we could think about that musically as well. So we could think about mental illness being characterised often by heightened or lowered affect. So how people are in themselves musically changes. So when someone is in a manic state, their affect might be quite heightened, and so people might talk particularly quickly or have very wide range of pitch, be unable to allow pauses or gaps for other people to interact with them. Likewise, people who present with depression often have flattened affect, so their voices won't have this pitch range in them, and it might be quite hard for them to create long musical phrases in how they interact with others. It can make it difficult for people to attune with others, and also for other people to attune with them. So often people experiencing mental health difficulties lack positive experiences of interactions, not just because of what they're doing, but because other people find it hard to interact with them. People find it difficult perhaps to wait for other people or to respond to other people, to be effectively expressive. They don't get a sense of being reciprocated. They don't get a sense of other people giving them back what they're offering. They perhaps don't get a sense that they have the kind of impact they want on the world, that they can affect what's happening, and a lack of a sense of being able to join in with what's happening. So when verbal transactions are compromised by mental illness, as it often is, it becomes harder to use language to think or to build relationship. But we do have the building blocks of musical experience for everyone, not just for people who consider themselves musicians. Music making offers a sort of boundary in itself, because if the work goes on in the music and it stays in the music, then once the music is finished, that work is done. And in that sense, it offers a boundary. It often also is described by people as offering a thrill. So particularly when people go beyond what they thought they could do, or they're interacting with a large number of people musically, they'll talk about the thrill of something happening in the music. It's a very different kind of thrill to that which some people with addictions crave, but obviously causes problems for them. It's actively shared work. So whether it's improvising as a group, which requires a degree of concentration, whether it's working together on a song or a recording, we're requiring people to collaborate with each other in a very active way. Music structure offers ways in and ways back in, by which I mean music that has a certain feel to it. So most of us, whether we know the language or not, can feel where the first beat of the bar is. We can feel where the beat is. And that helps us to come into it. It's not quite like trying to break into a conversation that's already going on and not quite knowing where to come in, because the music structures, it's like a framework that comes from the beat, from the meter, from the harmony, from the rhythm, from melody to some extent as well. And music structure organises us and regulates us and therefore aids social experience. So the fact that I get drawn into the feeling of a waltz because a waltz is going on helps me to be with the other people around me, and it organises me. Very often you can see people who come across as chaotic in many ways getting organised in music. And this is well known outside music therapy, but is very useful within music therapy. So now I'm just going to talk you through some specific examples which are perhaps more relevant to the focus of this conference. So these are contrasting examples of how music therapy can work in psychiatric environments generally. So the first I'm just going to briefly describe is of a man who presented to the outpatient department of a hospital without an appointment. So there was no expectation of him arriving. He came in off the street. He had previously been an inpatient in the hospital. He'd stopped taking his medication and was experiencing a psychotic episode, and he was not really containable in the outpatient department. He was pacing around the room, responding to voices. People waiting for their appointments were kind of backing off from him and giving him very negative experience. And so what do you do when you're overseeing that room and you don't know what to do with someone? You ring the music therapist and you say, can you do something with this person? And he followed me very happily to the music room and made use of instruments a bit like this and some others, talking all the time in ways which I could not interact with. It was very hard to follow the sense of what he was saying. He was being led by rhyming words and seemed to be going off into plots of films and perhaps responding to voices as well. But he was playing instruments as well. And what I could do was hang on in there musically with him. So when he was being very loud and dramatic, I could be loud and dramatic, but not in such a way as to kind of wind it up, but in such a way as to kind of underpin it and make it feel solid in some way. And when he became quiet, of course, I can quieten and accompany in a kind of harmonic way that lends a sense of direction to it. I hope I'll be able to demonstrate that to you in a few minutes. He played with me on that occasion for just under an hour, at which point a psychiatrist was available to do an assessment with him. And it was very useful to talk with the psychiatrist afterwards, because when I'd played with him, although I was working very hard in our interactions, it was also evident to me that he was able to be a bit responsive to me. So there were moments where he would wait for me to catch him up, and there were moments where he would allow me to join him in making a cadence together. So although he was in a state where he's not really supposed to be very able to take me into account, to some extent in music he could do it a bit. Another common scenario in music therapy is working with people whose affect is very much dampened down by depression. And so very often in those cases, we're helping people to dare to try something a bit more, to use phrases that are a bit longer or that go higher and lower. And in those cases, it's often a slow process. People need to feel comfortable, to relax into the process, and then help them to extend the phrases, and that's a very musical technique. In addiction, so I'm thinking very much of a particular person who is a long-term methadone user who in his youth was a drummer and played in bands and still retains an identity as a drummer, and his life is extremely chaotic, but once a week he attends a community-based group which is essentially a sort of choir come band, and he is the drummer. and he is the kind of the engine of this group. And when you put him behind a drum, put sticks in his hands, and the degree of coordination he can manage is quite remarkable compared to how shambolic he comes across as the rest of the week. And not only does he get that experience, but he gets the experience of other people acknowledging him for this and saying that he's amazing and genuinely being grateful to him for keeping this group of singers together, because without him, they would struggle, actually. Another kind of scenario that arises in music therapy is people trying out intimacy. So, as I said before, when people make music with another person, sometimes they're quite struck by the sense of closeness that can come quite quickly. And for people who find intimacy very difficult, this can be, on the one hand, quite thrilling, and on the other hand, quite frightening. So, making music with someone for whom intimacy is difficult, one has to be very aware of this kind of ambivalent response to it. And often it comes when it's least expected. It often comes through people singing with you and being very closely supported. It's very important that the experience is boundaried, as I said, by the music. I've had experiences of people clearly feeling this and then finding it difficult to come back for a week or two. And when they come back, they talk about how it was both very nice and very uncomfortable. And that's a very useful experience to start thinking about together, about why that should be the case and what's nice about it and what's uncomfortable about it. And is that just something that goes on in music, or is it something that goes on outside as well? OCD. So I can tell you a story about a young man who did have a musical identity, who used to write songs, who played guitar, and he left his hometown, came to London, started taking drugs, fell out of music, fell out of everything, fell out of his job in the end, and found himself essentially in his flat all the time until someone helped him to attend a day centre where he could do some creative things. His first experience of music therapy was quite a negative one. He said that he had an experience of just being told to sort of bang the instruments, and it didn't make any sense to him. But when he came to music therapy and could bring his songs with him, that's when it started to make sense. So he would bring little bits of songs he'd written, and our job at the beginning, my job, was just to help him piece it together. And I did really simple things like operate the recording equipment when he was ready to record a song, helping him to remember what we'd done the week before. And gradually he built up a repertoire of his own songs, which we were able to record and then go out and perform at open mic nights and things like that. So crossing out from the kind of clinical music therapy environment into the outside world, where eventually he didn't need me anymore. He could play with other people. And he tells a lovely story of music coming back into his life and how actually music therapy was just a bridge, really, from the kind of the chaos that he had into finding music again and helping music to be a force for creativity and joy in his life. And I'll quote him again in a minute. And then finally, I've already said we work with groups. Very often we work with groups in inpatient settings where things can be quite varied. So you have lots of different people with lots of different needs and in different states of mind. And what we really want to do is to help people function as a group for the 60 minutes or whatever it is that we have as a group. And helping people to have some awareness of what's possible in music rather than in words. And there are many examples that happen all the time of people kind of finding themselves relating differently. So very often what happens in music is someone takes a risk. Someone maybe starts singing a song or offers a melody or plays a chord sequence on the guitar, and then that gets reciprocated. And it might be the therapist that reciprocates it, it might be other people in the group that reciprocate it. But as this pattern of reciprocation grows, people who initially were quite ignoring of each other or quite negative towards each other can be drawn into doing something together. And it's been compared to the idea of social capital. I think it's not quite, it's sort of proto-social capital, but this idea that people are taking risks together and having an experience of reciprocation of that risk in a safe way within the group leads to changed experiences of self and others. And we know that that can have an impact on the atmosphere on a ward, for example. I'm not going to spend long on this. Just assessing usefulness, I feel I need to nod towards the evidence agenda. So there are increasing numbers of people working on developing the evidence base for music therapy, and actually for such a small bunch of people, there's an awful lot out there already. So there are lots of RCTs done in the field of mental health generally for music therapy, and a number of Cochrane reviews, which again for such a small field is an achievement. There's a growing body of evidence, particularly in relation to schizophrenia and depression, and beginning to be so in relation to addiction as well. That's very easy to find. You can find it the way you find evidence generally, Cochrane reviews, NICE guidelines, etc. But also, and I think particularly relevant to the way we think about the work, there's a growing literature highlighting the way that music therapy gets valued by people and settings. So it's not necessarily quite the same as clinical effectiveness. We know that the presence of music in a rehab setting, for example, can impact not just on individuals, but it can kind of lend a different feel to the place. We know that where people make music around lunchtime, for example, it changes the dynamics of the place. It can go horribly wrong, which is why you need someone skilled to facilitate it, of course. There's also a growing interest in what happens inside the black box. So whereas traditional RCTs tend to say, the treatment was applied, we see what goes in and we see what comes out, but we don't look in the box. A lot of research recently is beginning to look inside the black box, and this comes partly from sociology of music therapy. And also the fit between music therapy practice and recovery model principles has been very much articulated in the last few years. So this idea that when you're making music with someone in a duet kind of situation or as an accompanist, you're very much being led by them. And so the person in music therapy, even if at the beginning it seems like a weird idea, they are actually managing to lead the therapy and take it in directions that's meaningful to them. Leading on from that then, I just want to mention a few service user perspectives. So I'll just show you a little bit of this video. This is Elizabeth, who attends a group which is a kind of group for anyone and everyone. It's facilitated by a music therapist, but the idea is not to work on particular clinical aims, but simply to give people a space in which they can be musical, be creative, interact musically with other people.
I suffer from dysphagia and have mild autism, and it's very difficult for people to understand me because it's quite frustrating that I can't get my words out right.
Elizabeth's challenges are rooted in low self-esteem, low confidence, I suppose more widely known as depression.
I feel like I can't go on with life sometimes, and I think it's mainly to do with misreading people as well.
Elizabeth was originally referred to us a couple of years ago. We had a phone call from her mum, who was very anxious to find something where Elizabeth could go and fit in and make music with other people.
My first impression of Nordoff Robbins, I felt that it was incredible because the people were so welcoming, and it made me feel this is the place, the environment for me to be myself. Once again, all back
when she came to the group and she had specifically written a song referencing all of the group members and what she'd learnt from them. It was incredibly touching, and the time and the effort that she had put into it was such a transformation from where she'd started, this shy girl who was almost too anxious to come into the room, to writing a song, performing a song and involving the whole group. It was amazing.
Nordoff Robbins helps me in so many ways. I feel like this place is a safe environment, and I feel like I could be myself, and this is a place where you can forget all your problems. I see how music changes people in the group. It makes me want to come here more so I can get more involved.
Having a positive experience and going home and being able to talk about it, I imagine it's very life-changing for the whole family dynamic as well as for Elizabeth herself.
Without Nordoff Robbins, I would probably still be struggling every day. It's made a huge impact on my life, and I feel very privileged to be part of the team.
Steve is the person I was talking about who had OCD and played in bands when he was younger. And Steve and I wrote a chapter together for a book where we simply chatted together and recorded it and wrote it down about our work together long after we'd finished working together. And this is how he summed it up. This is his response to our conversation after we'd had it. He said, "As people, we need to make order out of chaos. And music's one way of doing that. It's the way that works for me. Everything was chaotic for me, and music helped me to order things. Even the music I was doing back then was chaotic, and music therapy helped me get it back into order. And that way my life has order too. I've got some control back, and the life I'm living now, thanks to that, well, it's full of music and it's amazing. I feel lucky." Steve is still unemployed, but he builds a life with lots of music in it. He has relationships with people based on making music with them. Now, not everyone can kind of do that, but for him, that was a particular pathway that music's opened up. And it's a common story that people value the making of music enough to take their medication, enough to want to stay out of hospital, enough to find meaning in this rather than other more destructive behaviours. And my last bit of feedback is from a radio documentary which features the work of SMART, which is St Mary Abbott's Rehabilitation Trust in West London, which is a kind of community based near Kensington.
This is a download from the BBC. This is a download from the...
I've jumped. Okay, I can't get to where I want to go, so I'm going to jump that. But basically, people are telling the stories of why they come to music therapy. This is for people who've either recently been discharged from the psychiatric service across the road or have been coming for some time as a kind of maintenance for themselves. It's a cafe. They go for tea and for lunch, and they make music, actively make music together as part of it. And people talk about how they've found a sense of happiness and joy and connection in this. Interestingly, what they don't talk about is that their symptoms are getting better, but they talk about meaningfulness in life as part of it. So we have a little time to make some music. So you'll notice I have a keyboard, I have a drum and cymbal. I realise it's an odd thing to do at a conference like this, but it might be just the easiest way for me to show some of the things that we do in music therapy. We're not doing music therapy here, we're just trying out using the instruments. So I'm just going to connect the keyboard up, and then I'm going to invite people to play. So summon up your bravery. Right, we're going to use quite soft sticks. I don't want to be too noisy for next door. But who fancies just coming and playing with me? Please do. Okay. Do you want to start with one stick? Okay. Anything you like.
On my own?
On your own. Well, I'm going to play with you. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Were you kind of nervous about it to start with?
And then I sort of just forgot that everyone was here. And at the end I sort of remembered and I thought, I don't know, I started to think too much and then got back into it again.
Yeah. So there were bits where it felt quite together and bits where we fell out a bit. Yeah. And we were making quite a bit of eye contact at the end, weren't we? So a bit of a grin as well.
That's good.
Yeah? Good. Not too uncomfortable.
No.
Brilliant.
Definitely not.
Thank you. Okay. Someone else? I can see people dying too. There you go. There you go. Thank you. Can you tell us what happened?
Yes, the nervousness disappeared. The nervousness disappeared, and it just became an experiment that then slotted into kind of a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And then the pattern developed, and then it kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
And then kind of came to a finale.
Yep. How did you know it was coming to a finale?
I don't know. It just seemed to come to a natural end.
Yeah. So that's what I meant about music has this structure, and we kind of feel it. We pick up these signals about, where we're at with it, even if we don't we can't say exactly what it was that made us feel that. Mm-hmm. There is something to musical structure that we get. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. One more person on the drum, and I've got a particular task for this person. Yep. Come. Put this down. Okay, so this time I'm going to ask you to just keep a pulse. So like steady pulse on the drum. That's it. Just don't change the pulse. Don't get faster or slower. Just keep it steady. Okay? Okay, so I asked you to keep the pulse steady.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was easy, but then it felt really difficult. I felt like I wanted to do what you were doing. I felt it was really tough. I found myself tripping almost. Like I felt like it was.
Yeah.
I was not able to keep what the rhythm of that, because it almost felt like my hand wanted to go with what you were doing.
Exactly.
It was really strange.
So it's really difficult to play in a different pulse to someone else.
Yeah.
And we naturally get drawn into being with another person musically. Sometimes the people we work with are actually very good at being separate and taking no account and being unresponsive. But if you put them in a situation like this, you can, as you called it, you can trip them and they go, "Oh, what happened?" And they may go back again, but they have that experience of getting pulled into something, getting pulled into a sort of interaction with people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done. Okay. Would someone like to come and play the keyboard with me? The answer is yes. I don't know who though. Ideally, yeah. Do you play?
No.
Excellent. Even better. Come and have a seat. So if you like, you can just use one finger. Okay? And we'll see what we can do. I'll take that. Okay. These seats are a bit low. That will be fine. Anything at all. What happened?
Well, I didn't know what to start with, really. And then, because it was kind of getting into a rhythm, then it just sort of started to flow a bit. And then it's like we were kind of playing together, really. Yeah.
So again, people talk about flow in music. It's one of the many things in life that has flow to it, because it goes on in time and takes you forward. People do get that sense of, I'm flowing. Yeah. So I was doing some things to try and make it sound okay. So if I just played random notes, it wouldn't have felt quite like that. So I was trying to adapt my notes so that they felt right with your notes. And also following your new ideas. So you went faster and sort of subdivided the notes, and that was great. That was something I could follow and show I was picking up from you. And then we made a piece which ended together. Great. Thank you very much. Okay. Another person to come and play? Yep, come. Oh, sorry, mind the way. Okay.
I took some lessons, but a long time ago. But
Fine.
I don't know much. Anyway.
Go for it.
Consider me as a non.
Fine. You do whatever you want to do. Okay, do you want to say something about that?
I don't know. I just think for me personally, music it's a huge part of joyful and happiness. And while I was playing, I was thinking I should relearn the lessons because it's something it's beautiful. And I kind of at some point you want to follow the other person. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like a connection.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. That's great. Okay. I now have a Zai in the phone. Just bring over here. Oops. I think that's safe. Right, I'll use a different stick for this. Okay, you want to have a go at the xylophone. This is slightly different because this is a melodic instrument, but it's a separate melodic instrument. So, you know, someone can be miles over the other side of the room. They don't have to be as close as they have to be to play a piano with someone. So, if you'd like to do this. Yep, have a go. Yep. I'll follow you. Thank you.
Yeah, so can you hear me? It's okay, it's working?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's fine. We can
Yeah.
hear you.
Okay. So yeah, first, because I've never played any instrument in my life. This was the first
Really?
time. But I remember when I was in rehab, the music helped me to, think a lot.
Yeah.
But I had an MP3 player. It helped me, to think basically. So I could connect to that, and I felt that I can connect to something except for drugs and alcohol. So yeah. But over here, when I was very nervous when I came here, and slowly the nervousness went away, and I could connect with you. I was trying to connect with you, and it was helping me to connect with something else.
Yeah.
That was the thing.
Yeah. You did something we call a glissando. Yeah, this kind of whee, which is a kind of thing I go, ooh, that's a nice idea. So it's your idea, and I can give it back to you, and then we have a piece of music that's kind of characterized by your idea. So that's the kind of picking up on an idea that someone offers and giving it back to them, so that it feels like a piece we've done together. Yeah.
Creativity also comes.
Absolutely, yes, and hopefully playfulness. Yeah, you might go through periods of feeling a bit bored and then try something new. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. And just finally, to sum up and say that music therapy is a way of offering musical companionship at times when other forms of companionship might be particularly difficult to access. So most people can go and access music for themselves. They don't need music therapy. They can play in a band, learn an instrument, play with friends, sing down the pub, whatever it is they do. But when it's particularly difficult to access those kinds of things, then music therapy might be a way of offering, here's a sense of me and you together. It builds on a musical understanding of health and illness. That often sounds quite odd to people, but I hope you might get an idea of what I mean by this idea that we can understand people's inability to relate to each other, to interact with each other, to wait for each other in musical terms, and then we can work with it musically. I think many people consider that quite a nice alternative to just thinking in a purely pathological way about it. Obviously, it doesn't replace pharmacology or talking treatments. It's different. We know from some of the RCTs done that for example, in schizophrenia, we know that music therapy seems to work quite well in relation to negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Drugs are very good at dealing with positive symptoms of schizophrenia. You can't just use music therapy, obviously. Likewise, the experience of being with other people verbally is a different one to being with people musically. So I'm not offering this as an alternative to talking treatments, for example. It's affective work, so it's work that has to do with people's expressivity, but also it's work that is connected with how people experience being with another person. That's why I wanted you people to comment on the work that they've done just now. In many cases, it connects or reconnects people with music, and it opens up musical pathways for recovery, whether that's going off and learning to play the guitar, doing some DJing, or just remembering that you can go back to your music collection and have a sense of connection and identity to that and use it as a resource to support you in times when you need it. And I hope you can see also it requires some musical craft. It's not enough just to stick people in a room with some instruments and think that music therapy is going to happen. You need someone who can do the musical work, but also someone who can think about what the connection between the musical work is and someone's life situation. And finally, I have a few references there. If anyone's interested, I'll move the xylophone out of the way and you can read them. So thank you very much for coming. If anyone has any questions, you're very welcome. Anyone want questions? Yep. I've been told to give you this to ask a question.
So I am I'm doing my master's in addiction psychology at the moment, and I'm a trained singer as well, and I wanted to maybe do a course on something similar, but not necessarily learn an instrument.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I've got two questions actually. I was wondering if there's a route that I can go down that would be using my vocal abilities, and perhaps accompanied by a musician of some sort. So that's my first question.
Sure. You mean in practice? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think musicians who are psychologists or nurses or psychiatrists are in particular positions where they can utilise that. And so, I mean, I'll give you a list of psychiatrists who've kind of drawn on their musical enthusiasm and experience to help things happen for their patients. You can set up opportunities for music making or for songwriting and things like that. The voice is a great instrument to use. Sometimes it's nice to have harmony underneath it, which can come from a guitar or an accordion or a piano or something like that. But I bet you could do quite a lot even just with your voice. Yeah.
And thank you. So my second question is, I love music. I think it's very healing for the soul, and that's why I want to integrate it into my work. But I'm interested as to whether there is much criticism from the industry around kind of music being a bit airy-fairy with this stuff. Yes. And if there has been, how have you kind of tackled that? Is it through the RCTs or, as a company, do you have like people that work around that stuff? How does that work?
So, as Nordoff Robbins as a charity has a small group of people who are a research team, and they do interest themselves in RCTs, but also other kinds of documenting of what goes on in music therapy. I think the criticism sometimes is that it's airy-fairy and it's just people having a nice time. And the other criticism is that sometimes groups, for example, can get quite excited and it kind of whips people up, and then you send them out back onto the ward or whatever in a heightened state. And that's something you have to kind of monitor and make sure that isn't happening. However, I would say that the way someone presents energetically, for example, on a ward can be seen as problematic. In music therapy, it can be seen as musical. And as long as it's contained musically, the same behaviour presents slightly differently in the two contexts. In terms of reassuring people, yes, the RCTs, the evidence-based, the collation of the Cochrane reviews, those are really important. That's not something that just Nordoff Robbins does, that's worldwide kind of collaboration between people. In Europe, particularly at Bergen University and Aalborg University in Denmark, big centres of that kind of research. But coupled with this kind of looking at people's experience of what goes on for them inside music therapy. That's something that has to go along with the RCT in order to explain what's actually happening and what the value of it for them is. So it's taking a two-pronged approach. It's both this and that to the research, I think. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. There are some leaflets about Nordoff Robbins at the back if you're interested. Otherwise, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.